World War II had more modernized guns than World War I soldiers, because in World War I they had rifles and submachine guns on each end of the trenches. But in World War II, most of the guns were mostly machine instead. World War I came first. Technology was scarce, with most of the war being done in trenches. Early airplanes were used, poisonous gas was developed for the first time. In World War II, tanks were used as the main deployment in many areas. Planes had improved, and bombers and fighters were heavily used. Submarines were also more heavily used. Encryption codes for secrets also became more complex. In First World War, the Ottoman Empire carried genocide against Armenians. In Second World War, Germans committed genocide against Jews and Romanians. World War II started when Germany again began its expansion into Europe. A lot of countries didn't like that, and so there was another huge war. It didn't make sense to say the war anymore, and so they came to be called World War I and World War II. The Japanese, expecting America to be occupied in the European War and considering America as a threat to its Asia-Pacific, so they declared war on the Americans. In World War I, in trenches and fixed defense with limited airships, with mortars and shells, also with ships and some subs. World War II in tanks with bombers and with the atom bomb. Eventually, rockets, ships, and subs were also considered a threat. Different countries, different technologies, different atrocities, different aims.
Conscription. Conscription was a system of compulsory service in the nation's armed forces. This rule of conscription was started in the year 1903 when the Defence Act Commonwealth had given the Australian government power and approval to conscript men. In World War I, men between the ages 18 to 26 in the year 1911 were forced to go to the military to fight for their country, as in World War II the conscription age had changed to the ages 18 to 35 in 1942. In the years 1916 and 1917, a man named Billy Hughes had led 2 polls and tried very hard to convince the public to vote yes for conscription in Australia. Billy Hughes had idea of conscription in 1916 was to send the Australian conscripted soldiers from the military to go and fight overseas. The vote was very close, but unfortunately he did not win. Conscription in World War I was that conscripted Australians were only allowed to fight on Australian soil. As in World War II, the Australian home front was extended as the conscripted Americans fought overseas, and so Australian soldiers had to extend their home front for the first time into Papua New Guinea. Both wars had the rule of conscription, and it was compulsory to enter the military in both World War I and World War II. Even though the age limit had changed, these men had no choice and were still forced to fight for their country. Conscription affected many people and was very hard, especially for the young brave men who were forced to enter the military to fight for their country in the war. Conscription had also had a big impact on the families of these young soldiers, as the mothers of these children had no choice but to agree to send their sons to fight in the war. There were many different people that were conscripted in the Australian military in World War II. These men were either named Chocos or Nashos. Chocos were known as the weak and afraid men who would melt in the sun, and they weren't as brave. As well as those tough, strong and brave men, they were known as the Nashos, as they were proud and upgoing towards the war. These names were only used in World War II, as in World War I they weren't called these types of names.
Why Australia went to war. In World War I, Australia went to war because Australia was originally a colony of Britain. In 1901, Australia became its own country. However, Australia seen ourselves as Britain. Australia still wanted to accept Britain's control of our seas affairs. Therefore, when Britain entered the war in 1914, Australia also entered the war to go help Britain. Before World War II, Australia saw itself as its own country. However, we were still close to Britain. Prime Minister Menzies made a speech saying there can be a doubt that we're great Britain. Stand there, stand, the people of the entire British world. But he meant that in Britain, if Britain went to war, Australia would follow them. World War II was also different because of the role of Japan. Australia was worried because Japan was getting closer to Australia.
Women groups would be more active. This gives a chance for women to go to join the war in nursing, naval forces, land forces, and also volunteer. Such groups as the Australian Women National League, the Australian Red Cross, the Country's Women's Association, the Voluntary Detachment Aid, the Women's Service Corps, and the Women's Peace Army. In World War I, the women would not be involved because society felt women were weak and also they were too scared of the front lines. They were involved in more activities in World War II, such as cooks, stretcher bearers, motor car drivers, interpreters, but the governments did not allow this participation. These jobs are available to women because the men needed more help in the front line. Also, they were getting wounded and needed medical teams to heal them. Also, when women women would help the men shoot in the front line. In World War I, women were not able to fight close to the front line because the men were fighting in the front line. In World War II, they worked closely in the front line because men needed help from the women. Also, the women would shoot in the front line. And other reasons is also women became more active with a lot of women joining the war. In World War I, women did not do jobs in societies, they were literally housewives. Women did men's jobs in World War II because the men would be at war at the war front. Also, women were allowed to go to war because were allowed to get jobs because the economy was down. Also, women would get money from these jobs.
The home front. In World War I, Australia went into an economic downturn. It was one of Australia's first major wars and Australia was still young and inexperienced. In World War II, Australia was more prepared and the war was actually an economic upturn for the country. It was a harder time for the country in World War I than World War II, with people having to ration their foods and their clothing to provide for the soldiers. The people that were born in enemy countries and that were living in Australia, known as the internal enemies, were all excluded in society. In World War I, it was the Turkish, and in World War II, the Japanese and the Germans. They were taken to be interviewed, and many of them were deported from Australia. In World War I, Australia's sporting comps and games were cancelled. They were thought to be a distraction from the war and was keeping young fit men that were eligible to fight from enrolling and going to war. In World War II, nothing of the such was put into place. In World War I, Australia wasn't fortifying its beaches. The home front was far away from the war. In World War II, as the Japanese began to approach Australia, barbed wires put on the beaches and locals were taught to use machine guns. Setting up a tactical retreat line was often used, where whole rows of heavy machine guns were used to protect Australia from possible invasion. In World War I, the home front was free of attack, but fear was all through Australia when Japanese began to air raid Darwin and Japanese midget submarines were found in Sydney Harbour in World War II. Two things that were common in both World War I and World War II is the way the people of Australia showed their true Aussie enthusiastic spirit and enlisting. But with that came the grief of the sons, fathers, brothers and uncles who were shipped off and not knowing if they were to return. Then for the families to hear the death toll would have hushed Australia all over.